Hello, everyone. Just want to let you know that we'll wait a few more seconds while we wait for additional folks to join us. We'll begin soon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Stanford Cyber Policy Spring Seminar. My name is Jeff Hancock. I'm a professor in the communication department here at Stanford and the founding director of the Stanford Social Media Lab and a affiliate of the Cyber Policy Center. I'm really excited to be here today with you all and to be moderating today's talk, which will be presented by two PhD students that I work really closely with, and I think you'll all be really impressed by. First is Ryan Moore. He's a third-year PhD student here in the communication department. And Ross Dalkey, also a PhD student in his second year here and a Knight Hennessy Fellow. They're going to be presenting their work examining exposure to misinformation in the 2020 election. I think it's really interesting, and we'll be comparing back to a study that looked at the 2016 election and exposure to misinformation. And they've even set up a poll to ask you all your opinion about what you think happens in 2020. So stay tuned for that. Ryan and Ross, are you all ready to begin your presentation?
I think we are, Jeff.
Okay, great. If you could start sharing your slides. For those of you that are in the participants group, if you have any questions, please use the question and answer function. At the end of Ryan and Ross's talk, I'll manage the questions and we'll get all of those sent over to Ryan and Ross at the end. All right, Ryan, Ross, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks for joining, everybody. As Jeff mentioned, our talk is titled Exposure to Untrustworthy Websites in the 2020 US election. I'm going to get us started. Okay, so I'm just going to start off with kind of some stylized facts about things we know about exposure to misinformation online. If you know this literature, you'll be very familiar with these. One finding is that relatively few people are exposed to misinformation online. When people look at what people do on the internet, not much of it is misinformation. Additionally, exposure is highly concentrated. So a very small number of people are responsible for a very large number of the misinformation exposures that happen. Relatedly, some groups or some types of people are more likely to be exposed to misinformation than others. One group that has emerged from several studies are older adults who are significantly more likely to be exposed to misinformation online compared to younger individuals. So, we might ask, well, how is exposure changing over time, or what do we know about that? Well, one comment, and really the reason that we set out to do this project was that the preponderance of studies on exposure to misinformation online were done during the 2016 election and study that time period, perhaps because misinformation rose to prominence during that time with the election. That being said, there are some studies that do look at change over time. This one from Alcott, Genskow, and Yu found that exposure or engagement with fake news websites on Facebook decreased from 2015 to 2018 relative to engagement on Twitter. So there's some evidence of change, but there's also some evidence of stability. This paper from Jennifer Allen and colleagues from Microsoft Research looked at people's media consumption from 2016 to 2018 and found that the amount of it that is fake news, which is that really, really small red bar at the top, was pretty stable over that 2-year period. So what we wanted to do was figure out, well, what did exposure to misinformation look like in the kind of next major political event after the 2016 election, the 2020 election. So you can imagine there are a couple different possibilities. One is that exposure to misinformation was greater in 2020. There could be several reasons for this. First, in 2020, there were big misinformation generating events, such as the emergence of the coronavirus pandemic and allegations of fraud in the 2020 election that could have created a lot of misinformation in the system. And also the infrastructure to disseminate disinformation among those parties that are interested in doing so may have improved from 2020 compared to what it was in 2016. So it's easier to target people. We also might expect that exposure was lower in 2020 than 2016. There could be a couple of reasons for this. First, there have been a number of steps taken by social media platforms and journalists to ensure the spread of credible information online and to decrease the spread of non-credible information. And additionally, there have been several interventions and educational programs seeking to improve people's ability to detect and subsequently avoid misinformation that could have lessened exposure. Either way, we think that understanding what exposure looked like in 2020 is important for a couple reasons. First, it can guide, knowing who's exposed and how much exposure there is can guide energy behind developing interventions and implementing policies related to misinformation online and making sure that those are based on an up-to-date evidence base. And additionally, knowing what exposure looks like over time can help us decide what is the appropriate amount that we should be talking about misinformation. So one emerging concern is that discourse around misinformation can not only make people more distrustful of misinformation, but also more distrustful of credible media and good journalism. And so if exposure to misinformation is going down, for example, and our discourse around misinformation is still really high, that could be having unintended negative consequences. And so knowing how exposure is changing can help tune that discourse appropriately. Okay, so to tackle 2020, we used a really prominent, widely cited study from the 2016 election by Andy Guess and his colleagues, and I'm just going to review that really quickly. So in this study, which is published in Nature Human Behavior, basically what they did is they had web browsing data from a nationally representative sample of Americans. So this is all the websites that people visit online. This is collected via YouGov, which is a survey purveyor. They have a browser extension called Pulse, which collects the data. They took that data and then they had a list of fake news websites that were compiled from a variety of academic researchers. These are websites that are known to be purveyors of false news. Then they take that list of fake news websites and they identify hits to those websites in their web browsing data from participants. And then they also administered a survey to learn who those people in their sort of web browsing data were, more about them. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to stick really close to the methods used in that paper and just update it for the 2020 election because it was based on the 2016 election. So we collected similar data, web browsing data from the same source, the YouGov Pulse program, in the lead up to the 2020 election. We also used the paper's analytic approach on this newer data to look at how exposure differed in 2020 compared to 2016. And because we've kept the approach and the underlying data source as similar as possible, the advantage here is that we can make pretty directly comparable estimates between 2020, our paper, and 2016, the original paper. While there has been some work on how exposure has changed over time, because each study has a different participants, a different data collection method, and different operationalizations of misinformation, it's kind of hard to make direct comparisons across them. So ours allows us to do that. Okay, so just to round us off here, I'm going to compare the Guess et al., the paper we're sort of building from, and our methods. So this is the timeline for the two studies. So in the 2016 study there at the bottom, they had 4 weeks prior to 2016 election day and 1 week after. That was the data that they collected. We have the same number of pre and post-election day weeks. The timelines just shift a little bit because the 2020 election was a little earlier in November than the 2016 election. Another really important thing here is the strategy that's used to identify misinformation in people's web browsing data. So in 2016, as I mentioned earlier, the researchers used lists of known fake news websites, which were compiled by academic researchers, most notably David Lazar and Matt Genskow and Hunt Alcott. We, for our 2020 study, built our database off of the same two lists that were used in the 2016 work, but we supplemented this with data from something called Newsguard. Newsguard is a browser plugin that you could go install right now that basically assigns quality ratings to news websites, mostly in search results. And so the database that underlies those quality ratings are ratings from professional journalists of over 7,000 news websites. So these are manual ratings. They say that the websites that are contained in this list account for 95% of online engagement with news. We particularly are interested in Newsguard's criteria does not repeatedly publish false content. So a website which fails that criteria, we say, is an untrustworthy website. The Newsguard websites are updated weekly. And so just looking at sort of the number of sites that they had in 2016 versus we have in 2020, the 2016 work had a total of 496 untrustworthy websites that they were able to use to identify in their participants' data. And we built on that 496 and added all the websites from Newsguard that it has identified as untrustworthy, and that gets us to about 1,800 untrustworthy websites. And this was really important to do so because in the world of fake news, websites are sometimes ephemeral. They don't exist very often. And so we couldn't just use the same list that they used in 2016 because it might be out of date. So we wanted to add in the Newsguard list to make sure that we had the best strategy that we could to identify misinformation. And I'm going to turn it over to Ross now, who's going to walk us through the results.
Thank you, Ryan. So I will be going over the results from the 2016 paper as well as our updated numbers from 2020. And so to start, the headline number is the percentage of participants that were exposed to untrustworthy websites. In 2016, they found that about 44.3% of American adults were exposed to untrustworthy websites. Then we updated that number for 2020, but first we want to ask you about your own thoughts. So this is something that we've been doing with folks as we're presenting this research is we run a poll and we ask people, compared to 2016, do you think that there was a greater percentage of people who were exposed to untrustworthy websites? Was there less in 2020 than 2016? Or is it the same number in 2020 as 2016? And so a poll should have popped up on your screen. And if you could fill that out. And so again, the question is, in 2016, 44.3% of American adults were exposed to at least one untrustworthy website. Do you think our results in 2020 are greater than 2016, less than 2016, or the same? I'll give you a moment to fill out that poll. All right. So looking at our results, it looks like 63 of you said that the number was greater in 2020 compared to 2016. So about two-thirds, and that's almost exactly the number that we normally get when we ask people this question. About 2/3 of people say that they would expect it to be greater in 2020 than in 2016. 12 folks said that it's the same in 2020 as in 2016. And luckily for us, that's not the case, because if it was, it probably wouldn't be newsworthy enough for us to be sharing it with you right now. And then 25 of you said that it is less in 2020 and 2016. And in looking at our results, that is correct. We find that this number in 2020 reduces by quite a bit compared to 2016. We estimate that 26.2% of people, there we go, we got the results, were exposed to untrustworthy websites. So this is a dramatic reduction in the number of people that were exposed to untrustworthy websites. And so in thinking about like what could possibly be going on, we asked a couple follow-up questions. So we also looked at the average percentage of people's news diets that misinformation or these untrustworthy websites made up of people's news diets. And so in 2016, it's about 6% of people's news diets were these untrustworthy websites. And in 2020, we find that that again reduces. Again, a pretty significant drop from 2016. So fewer people are exposed, less of their news diets are untrustworthy websites. But what about the average number of exposures amongst those who are exposed? So one possibility could be that fewer people are being exposed, but there's a higher concentration. They're seeing more of these untrustworthy websites. In 2016, the average person who was exposed to untrustworthy websites saw about 32 untrustworthy websites. And again, in 2020, we see a drop to about 22.8. Again, a pretty significant reduction when we're comparing 2020 to 2016. But yet there's another possibility. Maybe these untrustworthy websites were more engaging than in 2020 compared to 2016. So we also examined the average time spent on various types of websites, including untrustworthy websites. So on the x-axis here are the different types of websites. So the lightest gray bar are untrustworthy websites. Then on the y-axis is the average amount of time that a visit to each of these websites spent on that website. So untrustworthy websites, the average visit lasted for about 60 seconds. And when we look at the 2020 election, we find that, again, there's a reduction in the average time spent on these websites to about 50 seconds. And so all of this evidence taken together seems to pretty strongly suggest that visits to these untrustworthy websites are going down. And so we wanted to take a little bit closer of a look to who is this person specifically that is more likely to be going to misinformation, and did any of those patterns change? So here we are looking at the age of the participants. So on the x-axis are different buckets of age. So if you're under 30, you're in that first bucket and so forth. On the y-axis is the proportion of that group that was exposed to at least one untrustworthy website. So for example, the group of people who are under 30 in our sample, about 35% of them were exposed to at least one untrustworthy website. And for those who are over the age of 65, about 57 were exposed to at least one of these untrustworthy websites. And so that's the 2016 election, these numbers, and we updated them for 2020. And we see the same general shape where older adults are more likely to be exposed than younger adults. But as a whole, there's a drop kind of across the board in the percent that were exposed. So for example, those who are under 30 was 35% in 2016, it drops to below 20 in 2020. And even older adults, the people who are most likely to be exposed, about 57% were exposed in 2016, and it drops to about 37% in 2020 for those over 65. So again, kind of this reduction across the board in the percent of people who are exposed to untrustworthy websites. Again, a big drop. So we also looked at the visits to untrustworthy websites by media diet slant. So this was a big finding from the 2016 paper. On the x-axis is the average media diet of people put into deciles based on their media diet. So the people who are in the one bucket furthest to the left, they had the most liberal media diet. And people who are in the 10 bucket have the most conservative media diets, and then all the gradations in between. And then again, on the y-axis is the percent of people who visited at least one untrustworthy website. And so the important thing here is this kind of slanted V shape that you see, where it's really the people who have the most liberal or most conservative news diets were the most likely to be exposed to at least one untrustworthy website. So again, we update these numbers for 2020, and we find that the shape changes quite a bit. The whole left side of that slanted V shape kind of sinks down, but people in the most conservative media diets, they stay about the same. So when we're looking at who is exposed to untrustworthy websites, people who have the most liberal media diets, they continue this trend of dropping down across the board. But the people who are in the most conservative media deciles, their percentages of exposure stayed about the same. Again, the shape is changing here, and that's a big difference between the 2016 and 2020 elections. And so we looked at a little bit more about who is this person who is visiting misinformation, but we also wanted to examine why are these patterns changing and what can we tell based on where people are coming from. And so again, we look at the 2016 election compared to the 2020 election. On the x-axis are different websites, Facebook, Google, and Twitter. And then on the y-axis are the estimated percentage of visits of untrustworthy hard news or neither that are originating from a referrer. So basically, if we take a visit to an untrustworthy website, what percent of them had Facebook just before that visit to the untrustworthy website? So in 2016, Facebook referred about 15% of visits to untrustworthy websites. Again, we update these numbers for 2020. And we find that the results look different in some ways, but quite similar in others. And so in looking at Facebook, in 2016, Facebook referred or came directly before about 15% of visits to untrustworthy websites. We find that that drops pretty dramatically to about 7.5% in the 2020 election. So a big reduction for Facebook. But if we look at Google, Google went from referring about 3% of untrustworthy website visits to about 7%. So quite a big increase for the percentage of untrustworthy websites that are being referred by Google. And then we see a smaller but kind of similar doubling from Twitter, going from about 1% to about 2.5%. But this may not tell the whole story, because remember, the amount of fake news has shrunk dramatically in 2020 compared to 2016. So instead of just looking at percentages of referrals, we also wanted to look at real numbers. How many websites did each of these platforms refer in total numbers? And so we find that in the 2016 election, Facebook referred for the average person just over 3 website visits to untrustworthy websites. It's about 3.25. Google referred about 0.75 articles, and Twitter about 0.25. When we update these numbers for 2016, we find that again, Facebook has this huge reduction. And so Facebook, on the y-axis, is the average number of referrals to untrustworthy websites per person. Again, in Facebook, it's over 3, and it drops down to about 0.5 per person in the 2020 election. Similarly, even though Google's relative contribution increase in the past graph, we see that Google too has a slight reduction, and similar with Twitter. And so across the board, all these platforms referred fewer untrustworthy website visits in 2020 compared to 2016. And with that, I will pass it over to Ryan to talk about the limitations.
Thanks, Ross. Okay, so I want to just talk about some of the limitations of the comparison that we just walked through and of our project. Most of them relate to the data, the web browsing data that we've collected from YouGov Pulse and what it's missing. So the first thing to note is that this data only captures some static URLs. So if you go to a website and it produces a visit to a new URL, that's what we capture in the data. Imagine like looking at your own web browsing history. But there are some places on the internet where you can be on a URL, but doing lots of different things and the URL doesn't change. So a really good example is the Facebook newsfeed. If you go to facebook.com, it's going to stay facebook.com even as you scroll, endlessly through your newsfeed. And so we're not able to look within those URLs. We just know when people were at Facebook, then when they go to another website, back to Facebook, etc. Additionally, these are web browsing data that are collected from web browsers. And so they do not contain data or information about what people did in apps that aren't web browsers. This may be particularly important on mobile, where increasingly people are consuming information and news, more specifically in apps compared to in web browsers. And finally, the way that the analyses are done are at the domain level rather than at the web page level. I should have mentioned this earlier, but basically the way that the Newsguard ratings works, for example, is that they aren't about specific articles, but they're just about specific domains. So the New York Times is a domain, but the New York Times, hosts tons of articles. So this analysis is concentrated on domains that are known to be purveyors of false information rather than about specific articles. And so there may be, people who don't purvey misinformation all the time that sometimes share it, etc. It's important to note with these limitations that they all equally apply to the 2016 work that we were building from. And so we really think that our estimates are still pretty directly comparable. Nevertheless, it's important to point these out. And I think that some of them may explain why we may have seen some of the drops that we did, but we'd be happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. Okay, so to just conclude from this work, we found that exposure to misinformation in 2020 appeared to have dropped significantly from in 2016, kind of across the board. But misinformation still remains an important part of some people's information ecosystem. So we saw that the people that were more likely to be exposed in 2016 were largely the same people who were still more likely to be exposed in 2020, but kind of everybody's exposure went down across the board. Okay. So for the rest of the time that we have in our presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing next in our future work with this data. And it tries to answer the question of what is the role played by social media in leading people to visit, for example, these untrustworthy websites. And we got at that a little bit in this project when Ross presented the data about refers. But really what we're trying to do next is kind of go beyond that. So I'm going to kind of explain our approach. So this is the graph that we saw earlier in the presentation. It doesn't have the 2016 comparison, but this is the refers analysis. So what we have here on the y-axis is the percentage of visits to one of those website types that came from one of the websites on the x-axis, Facebook, Google, or Twitter. And just to, we're going to use the Facebook example of Facebook and untrustworthy websites just to sort of walk through this example. About 7% of visits to untrustworthy websites were referred by Facebook. That was the finding for 2020. So to illustrate really what's going on here, we can bring back our little adventure here and show that in this analysis, they look at the visits to untrustworthy websites, and they just look at the site that the people were at right before that. So this person was on Facebook, they went to untrustworthy websites. And so, what's probably happening here with this analysis is that people are encountering links to these untrustworthy websites on the platform, say Facebook in their newsfeed, and they're engaging with it and then clicking on it and visiting the untrustworthy websites. And so that's probably like a lot of what's going on here with the simple analysis. But we could also ask, what is the total role of Facebook in getting people to visit untrustworthy websites? And that probably contains more than just instances where people see misinformation, untrustworthy websites posted on Facebook and then choose to visit them. And so we want to answer this question: what is the total role of Facebook? But the existing work that we built from here and a lot of the literature in general, looking at how people visit disinformation websites, how people visit news websites, et cetera, kind of sticks with this refer analysis, which we only think captures a small portion of how people arrive at these websites via the use of other websites. And so to convince you of that, I'm just going to use one simple example. So consider this. Somebody's on Facebook and they're going through their newsfeed, and perhaps they encounter a link to a YouTube video. And so they click on that YouTube video and they watch it. And perhaps in the description or in the comments, there is a link to an untrustworthy website. And so they would then click that and visit an untrustworthy website. So in this example, you could say that Facebook did influence the person's visit to an untrustworthy website because it influenced their visit to a YouTube video, which contained that content. And then they visited. But it's important to note that this, even this simple example with 3 steps, is completely absent in the refers analysis, which only considers instances in which Facebook lies directly before visits to an untrustworthy website. And so you could imagine, this is a 3-step chain, but you could imagine this, going further and further out, where Facebook sends people down, to certain types of content, which then sends them to other types of content. You see this kind of thinking used a lot in popular conceptions of like rabbit holes, for example. And this is completely missing in the refers analysis that we did here. And so in order to better get at this question of like, what is Facebook or any platform's role in exposing people to untrustworthy websites, we're doing the following. So we're using simulation methods, which we'd be happy to talk more about, but I'm not going to go into too much right now, to create 2 worlds, 2 internets, basically, using in our data. One in which Facebook is there and people can use to visit any subsequent websites, and another one in which Facebook is not. And so we can compare those 2 worlds and count up in the world with Facebook, what is the number of visits to untrustworthy websites? And in the world without Facebook, as an option of places you can go on the internet, what is the number of visits to untrustworthy websites? And the difference between these 2 quantities, we contend, better captures Facebook's total contribution to visits to untrustworthy websites rather than the more simple refers analysis, which is really only getting at Facebook's like sort of contribution to exposing people to untrustworthy websites on the platform. So we think that this approach better captures the total role. And you could imagine a couple of different results here. On the one hand, you could imagine that if it is true that Facebook is exposing a lot of people on its newsfeed to misinformation websites that they otherwise wouldn't have encountered, that the world with Facebook is going to have more untrustworthy website visits than the world without Facebook. But you could alternatively imagine that if Facebook is better at keeping people from untrustworthy websites than other websites that they're going to use when Facebook is not available, that there actually might be less visits to untrustworthy websites in a world with Facebook than a world without. But without comparing the world with and without, it's really difficult to make claims about like the totality of Facebook's role in exposure to untrustworthy websites. And we can also imagine, kind of expanding this, outside of misinformation to looking at social media's contribution to visiting sort of like good things on the internet, such as like high quality journalism. So here we have, I'm on Facebook, I encounter a blog, and then in that blog is linked some kind of high quality news website. You could also imagine that, we can use other platforms besides Facebook and Twitter. And really what I'm getting at is that we are currently doing this kind of, going beyond the refers and looking at these total effects of 5 different social media platforms on exposure to 6 different types of information sources online, some that are, good, bad, and ugly, as we're kind of conceptualizing them. But that's what we're doing next. And we think that this is kind of a build on the refers work that is present in this paper and so many others in this literature as we drive toward the question that we're all really interested in, which is, what is social media's role in exposing people to these different types of news information online? And with that, I want to say thanks and really look forward to your questions. And I also wanted to acknowledge some folks that gave us feedback along the way. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Ryan and Ross. Very well done. Excellent presentation. We can now open it up to questions. We've got some already in the list, and I'll get them going. And then for those of you that have further questions, please feel free to add them into the Q&A function. First one is from Eileen. She wants to know if we have any information about consumption. She's interested, are people going there to see propaganda knowing that it's propaganda, or do you have any sort of like insight into like how people were consuming these things, and whether just any visit to untrustworthy website is the same?
Well, of course that, there's different things that can happen when people visit these websites. They can extract different information from them. They can go in with different priors. They may have some suspicion about the website when they visit it, or they may not. With this kind of passively collected behavioral data, we really just see what people do. And unfortunately, we don't know a ton about their psychological processing or motivations for consuming the content. You could try to infer some of that information from their behaviors. So doing things like the referral analysis, you could imagine doing more kind of complex analyses, but ultimately we're constrained to what people did. And we know a limited amount of information with this particular methodology about what they thought about what they did or why they did what they did, things like that. That's a great question, something that, can be explored with different methods.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Another question from Kyle about demographics. You both covered the effects of like older folks, their political orientation, but he was wondering if there were any gender, race, or ethnicity findings in the data.
We did fit a regression model in which we inserted all the demographic covariates that we collected. I'm trying to recall which of them maybe have been significantly related. So in general, political knowledge and interest are positively associated with consuming misinformation. Which may seem counterintuitive, but also kind of makes sense. Like these people, we know that consumption of news and political information online is pretty concentrated, and the consumption of misinformation is even more concentrated among people who are really interested in politics. The only difference between the only demographic indicator that made people less likely to consume was identifying as non-white. That held up both in 2016 and 2020.
Thanks. Someone else has a question. Is foxnews.com considered untrustworthy websites in this database?
It is not. And so every visit to foxnews.com is not being counted as a visit to a misinformation website. It is being counted as a hard news visit. And so this, I think, speaks to another one of the limitations that has been present across all this type of work, where they're looking at the domain level and not the URL level. And so you could imagine that there are some specific stories on Fox News, as there are on many types of news websites, that have fallacious information. And until somebody creates a data set of all the URLs that exist on all hard news websites, we're unfortunately probably limited to this domain level analysis, which kind of have to go like in aggregate. And so there are a lot of other websites that post a lot of like AP Newswire stories. And so it looks like they are, like, most of the things that they post are true, but they could have some specific URLs that are maybe intentionally misinformation.
Great. I'm just going to keep going down the list here. What about disinformation on the dark net? I think you could just maybe go over, Martha's asking this maybe before you got to some of this, but this idea of like the limitations of the ecosystem with this kind of open website analysis.
The dark net refers to like things that happen outside of conventional web browsers.
Yeah. So the dark net, or I think you could get in. Some other people are asking about the apps as well. Like, is there any way to do the apps and what the implications are for research of this kind?
Yeah, totally. I don't know about accessing the dark net specifically, if that's done through web browsers that are different than normal web browsers. If they are, though, like, if it's interesting, because if they are, those might still be web browsers, but if they're not compatible with the plugin that's used to collect data, then we're not gonna see it. But I think the more general point about apps that I mentioned in the limitations is super important, and it's important to think about its interaction with our sort of 2020 versus 2016 findings. These data, which rely on what you do in web browsers and what URLs you visit, are as we live in an increasingly mobile world where our consumption of all information, but particularly like information related to news, is occurring in apps, these data may become less illustrative of like everything you're being exposed to, right? They might be missing more. And so there's reason to believe that in 2020, people use apps more than they did in 2016, probably more than they did in 2012, and so on. And so I think one of the things that might explain some of the reductions that we find are because exposure to news or misinformation or just content in general is increasingly moving into apps or spaces that have end-to-end encryption, where the kinds of tools that are available to researchers to collect what you do online just can't get into, or they're not sophisticated or widely accessible enough yet to be able to be used in mass. And so I think that it's really important for us as a field to think about the implications of that moving forward. The advantage of our approach is because we use the same methods, we can pretty directly compare the 2020 to 2016 estimates, but the world has changed a lot since then. Media consumption has changed a lot, and the methods are missing important things that might be where some of this misinformation exposure is now living. So I think that that's one of the top reasons that, things that might have explained the findings that we had.
Good, thanks, Ryan. Clarification question, a couple of people had this, is around origination sites. Does Google include YouTube in this?
No, it does not.
Okay, so YouTube is separate, right? From
Yep. YouTube is separate and plays a pretty negligible role in this referral analysis.
Okay. Yeah, Milo has another question. Did you see at all any feedback loop between untrustworthy websites? Like, do they refer to each other? Is there sort of like a feedback loop there?
There is, but perhaps maybe less than you would expect. So we find that once you're on an untrustworthy website, there's about a 33% chance that your next visit is to another untrustworthy website. So you can imagine a lot of people getting stuck down this untrustworthy website rabbit hole, but 2/3 of people do get out of, like, their next visit is not to an untrustworthy website.
Okay, good. There's a couple of questions that would like you just kind of go over again, how you classified websites as trustworthy or untrustworthy.
Yeah, so in terms of the untrustworthy side, there are academic researchers who have tried to study this with this data, have accumulated lists of websites that are known to be purveyors of fake news or untrustworthy content. Some of those have been manually identified. Some of them have been with the help of journalists or other news professionals. Most of the research to date uses those lists that were compiled by academics, and since the first study, they kind of just been growing those lists. So we used those lists, which were used in the 2016 paper. We used them in the 2020 paper, but we added several more websites that were rated by Newsguard, which is an organization that has a tool that you could go look up and download that rates the quality of information websites for you on your own web browser. And we got access to the back end that they use to rate those websites. And it's, it was about, it was over 1,000 additional untrustworthy websites that professional former journalists that work at Newsguard, evaluated and rated as repeatedly publishing false content. And so we added those to the academic lists. Newsguard provides other information about websites. So in addition to that binary criteria, they also have a numerical score that ranges from 0 to 100. That is like a weighted average of whether or not certain news websites use journalistic principles in their, the content that they create. So we think that Newsguard is great because it offers multiple measures. It's not just a binary, is it untrustworthy or is it trustworthy, but it recognizes that these websites have lots of different dimensions. And I think we're interested in using those kind of more continuous measures in the future to add a little bit more texture here. But yeah, that's what we did for this paper.
Great. Related question. Did you include any hate speech type sites in this analysis? Like in particular QAnon or Great Replacement Theory, those kind of hate speech ones?
So some of the websites that were rated, you kind of imagine a Venn diagram where some of these data sets of untrustworthy websites do include some of those hate speech websites. This analysis in particular only includes those ones that were labeled as untrustworthy. And so again, some portion of hate speech or QAnon are in this, but not all of them. Our next projects, as we showed on the slide, where I'm sure you saw, do include those websites. Those websites do make up an even smaller portion of visits and a much smaller portion of people who were exposed. And so we're interested in digging more into those to see if kind of these patterns of concentration, low exposure, referrals, et cetera, are applicable across the board, because those websites in particular could have strong downstream effects.
Great. There's two related kind of questions here about future work. One person, Ernie, wants to know a little bit about what you think the role of AI is on the likelihood of being exposed with these these kinds of trends. And relatedly, one of the viewers wants to know about rabbit holes and whether in your future work you could do analyses that could see whether somebody's getting sort of like caught in a space where there's a lot of untrustworthy content.
I can do the first if you want to do the second. Yeah, so on the question of AI, there's obviously lots of different possibilities. Jeff, maybe you could even chime in on this one as our collaborator. But I think, one of the questions that's raised by our findings is, maybe what platforms are doing is effective in their efforts to weed out misinformation. We see Facebook, they're referring 15% of untrustworthy website visits in 2016. It's down about half in 2020. And as I mentioned, platforms have taken a lot of steps since 2016. They've been under a lot of scrutiny on this exact point. So they with the scale of the amount of information that's contained on these platforms, we need automated approaches, or I'm assuming that these platforms are, engaging and investing in automated approaches to identify which content is trustworthy, which is not, which content, may be like harmful or which isn't. So I think, the role of AI, maybe it could be working, and it could partially, work to explain this reduction and the reduced role of some social media platforms. But there's layers of speculation there that I'm imposing on our findings, which, as we mentioned, can't speak to all that. But that's one possibility. Jeff, not sure if you have any other ideas there, but I know there's a lot of interest around using AI, and I'm assuming in the platforms for that exact purpose.
Yeah, I think that's just a huge, massive question that we don't actually have data to, because we can't see how the AIs are doing the recommendation. We might be able to get some information from the Social Science One project. There's a couple of studies that will be coming out soon that look at like different types of algorithms for a news feed and what that did to browsing behavior, but then also beliefs. So we'll have to wait for that to come out. But I think as of now, we don't actually have we don't have good data on that. Go ahead, Ross. Yeah.
The second part on rabbit holes. I'm particularly interested in rabbit holes, and we have some follow-up studies. We have a lot of follow-up studies. As you can imagine, STAT is very rich. There are many different ways to go, where we are examining rabbit holes to untrustworthy websites, to QAnon websites, to hate speech websites, etc. And so, we said the average person who was exposed to 22 websites. But as you can imagine, there's a ton of variance in that. Most people were only exposed once. Some people were exposed 1,000 times. And so we are currently conducting some analyses that can try to illuminate the different features of the rabbit hole, if you will, for which people are the rabbit holes deeper, for which people are the rabbit holes steeper, for whom do they get faster into these content. And finally, like, who is able to break out of these rabbit holes and how quickly. And so we're excited to share that research, hopefully sometime in the not too distant future.
Great, excellent. One question, if you could just do a really quick clarification, just to remind everybody, Karina was asking, just a reminder of how the browsing data was collected. So I think if you just could point to the tool that you're using, that'd be great.
Yeah, so there's a survey company called YouGov, and they give surveys to panelists of people all over the world. And in addition, a large number of their survey takers also install the software on their desktop, laptop, computers, in addition to mobile phones, that passively collects the websites that they visit. I think it's a browser plugin on browsers, and it's an app on mobile. And they get paid for sharing that data with YouGov. And so as a researcher, you can use YouGov to give people surveys. And for people who take those surveys, you can also purchase some of these web browsing data, and they consent to that data being collected, and they get compensated for it.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. A couple of related questions here around content, and I know the answer, but I think it'll be good for us to share with everybody. So some people are wondering, do you track content, like the kinds of content that people are exposed to? And does the content change across 2016 to 2020? Or how do you think about content, I think, in these contexts?
So I'll say yet again, another work stream that is currently in process, in which people are probably working on in the lab right now. And unfortunately, the comparison of 2016 to 2020 is not available to us because of privacy protections and things like that. But we do have the 2020 data. We have scraped the URLs that we can of the content. We don't have any findings to share in this moment, but we have a couple work streams in terms of ephemerality of misinformation. And so how much of the misinformation that people are consuming goes away after some time that people have consumed it, how much of it is persistent? Are there differences in the content that is ephemeral versus not? And then are there ways to identify the differences in misinformation, and ultimately getting to kind of a previous question on can we ascertain effects of specific types of content, or can we tell anything about the demand for that sort of content?
Great, thanks, Ross. Here's a question about, I think, Newsguard and the other databases, and somebody's wondering, how do you verify that the fact checkers themselves for untrustworthy websites are unbiased? How confident do you two feel about the sort of objectivity of classification here, and untrustworthy to trustworthy?
Well, I feel more confident than if we had done it. Newsguard employs professional journalists and editors with lots of experience to manually rate the websites. That seems like a sound approach to me. There is, however, research suggesting that even fact checkers can disagree. Professional fact checkers and fact checking organizations sometimes disagree on their judgments of the veracity of certain claims. And so, sometimes the truth is tricky and is murky. I think what's to our advantage here, and maybe makes me more confident in the ratings that we have, is that they're at the domain level, as I mentioned before. And so rather than having to make a judgment about a particular story, they're drawing on all the stories that are published, the most traffic ones from a given site. In general, do those end up being, containing false information more often than they contain true information, that kind of thing. And I think that level of abstraction means that there's maybe a little bit less room to make errors, because the level of the kind of like the abstraction of the classification is higher. So a little bit of a politician-y answer, but I think that I feel confident in them. But of course, this is very difficult. And there's people working on, how good are lay people at, fact checking versus professionals, and can we teach people to be better? And there's, we're also doing research on that, and kind of educating people to get better at that. But it's tricky.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Our colleague Danya has a question for you. She says, not only is it interesting work, but she wonders, why do you think people so often, like in our poll, believe that misinformation has increased? Why is that a thing we're seeing regularly in our polling?
I'll say two ideas. One is that the list got a lot bigger. I feel like maybe we didn't prime you a lot on that in this one, but the list of misinformation websites that we used in our identification was almost 3 times the size of the 2016 one. So I think that might make people think it's larger. But I think less semantically, like 2020 was filled with misinformation. It felt like it. It felt like there were events and conditions around the election, around COVID, around other national and international crises that proliferated misinformation. Or maybe it's just how much we heard about misinformation. And that's kind of what I was getting at with the discourse around misinformation point. We hear a lot about misinformation and its threats and, its omnipresence. Our data suggests in people's media diets, like exposure is going down. So I'm really interested in the disconnect between those two things. Why is it that we have this sense that it should have been higher when it's not? And of course, there's tons of alternative explanations, but I think that's really interesting. It's maybe that we heard more about it than we actually encountered it.
And to be clear, we thought it was going to go up too.
Yeah.
we thought we were going to get this new database, Newsguard, updated weekly. Like, oh my gosh, we're going to find everybody was exposed. And then I we double checked everything, like quadruple checked everything. We're like, I guess this is it.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when you first told me, I was very surprised and made you run all the analyses again. Ross, maybe you could also, in addition to Ryan's responses, say a little bit about the timing, perhaps, of the analysis that you're referring to in regard to the election.
Yes, that's another great point, where the data that this analysis is looking at is 4 weeks prior to the election and 1 week post. And so we are looking at the same time frame as 2016. That's the time period that they happen to have. And so if you think about the types of misinformation that was out there during the 2020 election, it's possible that most of it was propagated after the election with the Stop the Steal stuff, where this false belief that Trump was the true winner and that there was voter fraud in mass. And so possibly most of the exposures were happening after the election, whereas simply because of the wanting to make the direct comparison, we truncate the data. And so possibly there's something with the time frame, and that's a part of the rabbit hole analysis that we're looking at, is do things change before and after the election?
Great. And Colin has an interesting comment here where he's noting that, perhaps not including Fox could contribute to that popular feeling of there being a lot, but then in our analysis, there's not. And I think it's a fair point, but there's a bigger one, which is like at the time, the president of the United States was saying, stating false information. So that regardless of whether it was on Fox News or not, there would be these kinds of exposures. But again, that occurs after this sort of tightly controlled time frame where we're trying to do apples to apples. Yeah, good. And Garrett, related to rabbit holes, Garrett's got a paper here regarding rabbit holes, and apparently they're pretty rare according to one study. I've got it, so you guys don't have to worry about it. I'll share it with you later. Was there any effect of COVID in here? So this person's, asking a difficult question, and I think I know the answer here, but like, COVID affected older people the most. We see a big decline in older folks getting exposed. Do you think there's any role COVID could have played here, either making them more aware, more fearful of going to those kind of places? Were there fewer older adults because of COVID? Are there other reasons why there might have been that decline related to COVID?
We asked a lot about COVID in our surveys. We asked, did you get COVID? On what day did you get COVID? To what extent are you self-isolating, et cetera, et cetera? And kind of any way that we look at the data, we just can't find any sort of effect. When, we have some people who got COVID during our time period of analysis, and their consumption patterns on multiple levels don't change before and after. So there's no either like COVID being a vector to misinformation, nor is there like COVID being as a result of untrustworthy website exposures either.
Yeah, and we also didn't parse the untrustworthy content in our study to be COVID or non-COVID. A lot of folks are interested in doing that. There's maybe more COVID misinformation in our time period than election misinformation for the reason Ross just gave, but we did not parse the content that way.
Okay, let's go with one last question here. I think, well, one comment here from Sinclair is like, isn't your paper more of an argument that disinformation or misinformation has been mainstreamed in 2016, compared to 2016? And I think that's an interesting question. These two are combined, related. So Mike and Colin are asking questions. So Mike's saying like, look, young people are really on apps all the time.
Yeah.
And Colin's asking about, are you going to work with platforms? So we recognize the limitation, right? We're not seeing stuff in apps. What are your thoughts about, what is a possible solution, or how should researchers in the future deal with the fact that there's this whole ecosystem on apps that we're not seeing in these open web analyses?
It's tough. I mean, there's folks here in the Department of Communication who have this approach called screenomics, where they capture a screenshot every 5 seconds from people's smartphones. And that allows you to see whatever they're doing, whether it's in an app, in a web browser, in settings, like all content. But those data collection approaches are difficult to get that data from folks, and very difficult to analyze because you basically just have tons of images. And the data in this study, which was just lists of websites that we had to match to other lists of websites, is simpler, but it still took a while. So I think that there are some researcher solutions. There may be solutions in collaboration with some of the apps or with some of the platforms. I don't know what those look like exactly, or what the future looks like there, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I'll close things out with kind of a thought on that, because I think it's super important. One is we do need to start working with platforms, especially places where young people are right now. Obviously, that's TikTok, and thinking about misinformation in these sort of video forms, which would be a very different approach than this. The other is the movement to encrypted channels, and that makes research even by the platforms, really difficult. We have one project going with some folks in computer science, Michael Bernstein and a computer science student, Raghavi, that's looking at when it comes in, you can get a notification they have a message, and then there's this URL, and we can identify that and compare it to our untrustworthy one. So I think there's maybe places where we can see interventions, but it's going to be difficult. There's no question as the ecosystem evolves. Well, I'll just say there's a lot of nice comments in here as well for both of you on a great presentation. I'll add that as well. Well done. And thank you to the participants for being here. Really appreciate you spending the time and all the great questions. And great job, Ryan and Ross. And thank you to the CPC and the Hewlett Foundation for supporting this. Here's some more dates and talks coming up. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.